Hey there, YouTube friends and family. I just wanted to do a video on the importance of practicing limitations. As a trumpet player that not only plays classical music, but a lot of other genres, including one of my favorite, jazz, I am in the habit of improvising quite often. And one of the things that I find with improvising is that the act of improvising itself makes more clear to you what your limitations are. What I mean by this is if somebody says to you, hey, why don't you solo over this? Maybe it's some chords, it's a groove, something going on, and you don't know what to do all of a sudden. The problem with that, especially if you're new to improvising, is there's so many things you could play, so what the hell are you actually going to play? That becomes the question, right? So the problem there is that you don't have a box. You're not in a box to begin with. Being in a box, having restrictions on your playing actually sets you free and allows you to be more creative and hones you into a specific direction, which can actually, like I said, be very liberating and allow you to be, in fact, more creative than if you had no bounds at all. And it's very daunting at that point. You're like, well, what do I play? I don't know what to play. And then that's when people start to fall back on crutch systems, like playing a blues scale ad nauseum, or just playing the notes of the actual chords. And if you're just playing the notes of the actual chords, that's kind of akin to taking blue pictures of blue items in front of a blue backdrop, right? The backdrop or the chord changes is just there to provide contrast for what you're playing in front of it, right? So one way you can start off with this idea of practicing limitations is you can just assign yourself something random. For example, like I'm going to make a whole solo composed out of something that sounds like my name. So my name is Charlie Porter. Charlie Porter. Dabo-de-dib. Dobo-de-dib. So that gives me a rhythm. So if I want to, I can start actually making a solo. Charlie Porter. You get it, right? So it's real simple. Actually, another way of thinking that is basically it's an assignment of saying, hey, there's going to be 4 eighth notes. Do-do-do-do, right? And you got to play with just those 4 eighth notes. What's another way you could say it? You could say, okay, you know what? I'm gonna do I'm gonna improvise freely, but I'm only gonna use, say, 3 pitches. Maybe those pitches are C, E, and F sharp, right? That's just random. So. And then you start to see what you can come up with just doing those 3 notes. And what it does, since you already have the notes mapped out for you, is it starts to actually, kind of the way someone who might lose their vision starts to hear better and focus more on their hearing. You stop having to think so much about pitches, and you start thinking more in depth about rhythm, and you start thinking more about phrasing and dynamics. So think of it as kind of like legs on a table. As soon as you lose one leg, the other legs have to become stronger. If you lose 2 legs, then the other 2 have to be really strong, or else that table falls down, right? So what we're doing here is definitely limiting ourselves to fewer legs on the table, but again, we're giving those legs more attention. What are a couple other things that we could do as limitations? Really, sky's the limit here, so it could involve anything regarding dynamics, texture, pitch, phrasing, phrase lengths, register, high, low, making use of certain types of sounds that are more, say, vocal in nature, which is definitely something we do in jazz. There's lots of things that you could work on. For example, let's say that my time is not so great, which is the case for so many musicians. In fact, I'm always working on my time. So maybe one thing I want to do is take a metronome, right? Play with that metronome, but I'm going to limit myself so that I don't play on the downbeat. I can play, maybe I'll try every phrase on the and of 1. So if I did that, it'd be like 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. and then maybe I'll do the same thing and start on beat 2, and then the same thing and start on the and of 2, and then on 3 and on the and of 3. So many people, they don't realize it, but they're one bound. Same thing is true even harmonically. A lot of people are bound to the root of the chord. So if you had a limitation, you say, you know what, I'm going to go through these chord changes, but I'm going to start on the 3rd, or I'm going to start on the 6th, right? You go through, and basically, here's the thing, you don't have time in one lifetime to work on every single limitation. But if you set some limitations that you come up with creatively, then actually what you're doing is setting in motion the template for your musical personality. Because your musical personality is going to be basically everything that you've practiced as an individual. All the limitations that you've set to practice in your playing, they become actually the fabric and the vernacular of your playing itself. And if you were to only play some limitations that somebody else told you and provided with you, then you would start to sound a lot more like them. But here's the thing, when you're choosing what limitations to practice and how you're going to go about it, just keep in mind the basic idea that makes everything in life worth listening to, or worth eating, or worth seeing, or worth anything, and that's balance. We have to have a sense of balance, aesthetic balance, balance of taste, balance of smell, all these things. If you eat a meal and it's just all salt, right, you're not going to want to eat that again. Or if you have a garden and it's only one plant in the whole garden and it's a monocropping, you get what I'm saying? Like, things have balance because they have enough highs, they have enough lows, they have enough softs, they have enough louds, they have enough and also enough space, right? When you're making a solo, the thing that makes you interesting to someone is also the balance of whether you're giving them something that they can understand and something they expect to some degree, but also something that they don't expect at all. In fact, that's why some jazz musicians, I think, were also avid boxers. And if you think about the art of boxing, with boxing, you don't want to be too predictable. If you give that same left, 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 right every single time, then guess what? That's not going to be so good for you in that match, because the other boxer is going to know exactly what you're up to and they're going to knock you out. So obviously in music it's not as violent as that, but with the audience, you definitely want to be giving them some stuff they expect, but then also giving them some stuff that they didn't. And this is not only particular to jazz, this is also in classical music. Think of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Why did it cause such a ruckus? Because he gave people some stuff classical form-wise which they expected, but also did some stuff that totally caused things to go in a different direction, right? And this is nothing new. Over time, people become used to one thing, and then other people have to come along and do something a little different. This is, I think, one of the hallmarks of jazz musicians since the creation of this music in the first place, is that everybody that comes into it tries to do something new, tries to be themselves, tries to find their own vernacular within the larger vernacular of the jazz idiom. And while I'm talking about that, just for a second too, what is it that makes jazz improvisation jazz versus any other improvisation? And I think if you're not studying solos, if you're not actually transcribing, and you're not actually learning the language of so many other great players that came before you, starting with Louis Armstrong and going all the way through the lineage, then you're actually missing out on what makes jazz jazz. Otherwise, you could just call it improvised music. But if we're dealing with jazz, we're actually dealing with a language that's been passed on and added to from player to player to player. So when you hear someone that has the history of the music in their playing, even if they sound like themselves, that's not what I'm not saying you have to sound like Charlie Parker, but the way that we innovate is not by creating something new. Innovation is just creating a subtle change on something that was pre-existing. In order for that to happen, you have to actually know the thing that was pre-existing, right? So to finish it off, if you haven't checked out Clark Terry and his 3 steps to improvisation, the first one is imitation, the second one is assimilation, and the third one is innovation. And guess what? The third one becomes effortless if you take care of the first 2. So alongside of transcribing, which is going to be the best way to get imitation, that means like you hear a solo, you copy it to a T. every single thing about it. Don't write it down. Make it an oral experience. Use the ears. That. Also do some stuff that's going to be good for your left brain, because that's more right brain doing the imitation. And the thing is, listen, if we're reading charts, you're going to see chord changes, you're going to see stuff like that. So what you might as well do is learn to read those chord changes, know your chords, know them in their inversions. Don't just know it like this, but know it like this. And then back down as well. And so know your chords, but then another thing you can do is practice these limitation exercises. So that's going to actually start off as kind of a left brain thing, but just know that anything you practice on the left brain side, meaning stuff that's technical in nature that you're not really hearing at first, what it starts to do is it starts to meld over into the right side, meaning we start to actually hear it. And anything that we play as improvisers, we need to be able to hear it first. We're not just playing completely from a schematic blueprint in our brain telling us what we need to play. It's hearing based. Even the most smart jazz musicians throughout history, if you were to ask them what they do when they're playing, they just say, man, I'm hearing it, I'm just playing. And that's the best approach you can have. If you're trying to be all scientific about your solos and trying to, like I said, map them out, most likely people aren't going to be digging on them, and most likely they're not going to be grooving with the rhythm section, because chances are you probably aren't even listening to the rhythm section because you're thinking about how hip your solo is going to be. Anyway, I hope this little tidbit on limitations and some of the other stuff that I talked about is going to be helpful for you. And if you like this video, please subscribe and leave some comments, and I'll try to make some new videos very soon.